the United States government is prepared to respond in that type of way. Things like that always have to be backed up by a credible military response if necessary. Hi, everybody. How are you today? Hope you all had a great long weekend. Matt, welcome back from your trip.
I feel like I've been gone for weeks.
I feel like you've been gone for weeks, too. Nice to see you all. And we have a AFP stand-in today. So, hi, sir. Welcome. Nice to see you here. Start out with a couple announcements this afternoon. First is about the Deputy Secretary's travel. On Friday and Saturday, Deputy Secretary John Sullivan led the State Department's delegation to the Munich Security Conference. He participated in a panel discussion with a number of world leaders and reaffirmed the United States' commitment to nuclear nonproliferation and also arms control. While there, the Deputy Secretary conducted some bilateral meetings with senior officials from China, Germany, Sudan, Tunisia, Ukraine, and also the Vatican to discuss a range of issues of mutual concern. The Deputy Secretary traveled to Rome on Sunday, the 18th, for meetings with senior Italian officials, including the Foreign Minister, the Minister of Economic Development, and the Interior Minister, to discuss our shared priorities in Ukraine, Libya, Iran, and the Sahel, as well as our cooperation in the fight against ISIS. He also met with local journalists and think tank representatives and spoke to a group of students, members of civil society, and the media about the importance of the U.S.-Italian alliance and our cooperation on security issues around the world at the Center for American Studies. In both Rome and in Munich, the Deputy Secretary met with our mission staff and thanked them for the important work they do to advance U.S. policy. Today and tomorrow, the Deputy Secretary will visit Kiev. His visit will fall just one day after Ukraine celebrated the 4th anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity. There, in addition to meeting with President Poroshenko and other senior government officials, the Deputy Secretary will deliver a public speech to an audience of civil society leaders, students, and media at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Diplomatic Academy, where he will underline the United States' commitment to stand behind Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression and press Ukraine's leaders to continue progress on critical reforms and renew their commitment to uproot corruption. Following his trip to Ukraine, he will go to Latvia and then Brussels, and I'll provide you with updates on that as the week goes on. In addition to that, I'd like to highlight something that's very troubling that's taking place in Syria right now. The United States is deeply concerned by the escalating violence in the Damascus suburbs of East Ghouta. Recent reports indicate airstrikes directly targeted hospitals and what little civilian infrastructure remains, resulting in more than 100 civilian deaths in less than 48 hours. The escalation is exacerbating the already grave human suffering of nearly 400,000 people. It also increases the number of individuals who require urgent medical evacuation, which already stood at approximately 1,000. The Assad regime's siege and starve tactics are creating a humanitarian disaster, or I should say are adding to the humanitarian disaster there. The horrors of East Aleppo are being repeated in East Ghouta with the ongoing slaughter of trapped civilians and woefully inadequate access for humanitarian actors. In such a dire situation, we should express our admiration and our deep appreciation to the medical workers and also the first responders in East Ghouta who both risk and lose their lives every day trying to help civilians. We call on all parties to commit to the unconditional de-escalation of violence. Russia must end its support of the Assad regime and its allies. They're responsible for the attacks, for the dire humanitarian situation in East Ghouta, and for the horrendous civilian death toll. The United States supports the United Nations' demand for a month-long cessation of violence to allow for the unfettered delivery of humanitarian supplies and the urgent medical evacuation of civilians in East Ghouta. The cessation of violence must begin now, and those needing emergency assistance should be allowed to evacuate immediately. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Hi. Thanks. I want to start in Syria, but further north first. Mm-hmm. What's your understanding of the situation in Afrin right now? And coming on the heels, well, we'll start with that.
Okay. Well, let me add this. The United States is not operating in Afrin. The United States is not equipping anyone in Afrin. So our knowledge in terms of what is going on in Afrin is somewhat limited because we're not operating, because we're not equipping there, because U.S. forces are not there.
So, okay, so you don't know at all what's going on there? You don't know that if whether or not Syria, I mean, fine, you may not have people there, you might not have people who you're supporting there, but you have eyes in the sky and other ways of finding things out. So, but you don't know whether or not it's true that Syrian troops have gone in with the permission of the Kurds
Matt,
or whether
I'd have to refer you to DOD on that. Perhaps they have something that we're not able to provide on that matter. You know, I can tell you that the Secretary had some productive meetings with his counterpart and also with President Erdogan in Turkey, where they talked a lot about the overall situation in Syria and our concerns about that, in which we continue to stress for a de-escalation of violence, for people to not take actions that would escalate and exacerbate tensions there, and to keep an eye out for not striking civilians. It's certainly something that we've stressed.
Right. So when he was in Ankara, you know, there was this agreement in principle, I suppose you could say, to calm things down, to repair the U.S.-Turkey relationship, but and start to do that in northern Syria, Mondage in particular, but you know that would include the whole thing. That seems to have kind of collapsed, has it not? I mean, it doesn't seem to have lasted much longer than even over the entire weekend.
Well, let's look back at this. The Secretary just days ago sat down and met with his counterpart and also with President Erdogan. They recognize that perhaps we haven't working well enough together over the past few years. That was a commitment that the Secretary and President Erdogan made to one another. As NATO allies and partners who both share in the interest and the shared goal of defeating ISIS, we are now going to start to work together in a better fashion so that we can achieve those mutual goals.
But that does not include dealing with the Afrin situation?
Look, some of these are private diplomatic conversations that I'm not going to be able to get into for you, but I can tell you they agreed to sit down and have a series of meetings, some working groups that they put together, where we can look at determining ways that we can better confront the situation there.
Okay, but it sounds as though then that you've entirely separated off this one situation from the rest of it. And I get that you're not there and you're not supporting anyone that's there. But the Turks are involved here, and that not so far away there are U.S. forces. So I'm just wondering if they decided to intentionally leave the Afrin situation out of this new working group dynamic, or if
perhaps that is in the working group dynamic. I don't know that. These are some of the private diplomatic conversations. As you well know, the Secretary firmly believes that sometimes he can achieve the best results, get the best results for Americans and for others where we're engaged and having private conversations behind the scenes.
Right.
And in a CBS interview, Secretary Tillerson said that China would have an important role to play once we get to the negotiating table. So does the U.S. support a return to the six-party talks or some other sort of multilateral framework?
Yeah, I'm not going to commit to any kind of framework in which the United States would sit down and have talks. I know everybody's anxious to talk about talks and all that. We're not there yet. China obviously has unique leverage over the DPRK because it's its primary trading partner. In terms of China, we've had many frank conversations with Chinese officials saying that they can certainly do more to help us and to help work with the maximum pressure campaign. They, and let me remind you, signed on to the 4 unanimous UN Security Council resolutions to crack down on the DPRK.
If there were to be some sort of multilateral framework, what other countries would be at the table?
You think I'm going to answer that question?
Possibly.
No, no, we're not going there. We are not at that point yet. I know some of you like your hypotheticals, but I'm not going to jump into that. Okay. 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 Hi. Yeah.
So the South Korean defense minister said that the U.S. and the ROK will announce plans before April of resuming the postponed joint military exercises. What is the U.S. position? Are we planning to go ahead with them starting in April?
Yeah. So some of this would be under. Some of this would be under Department of Defense. I have no reason, though, to believe that we wouldn't restart some of our exercises that we do. We've done those for many decades. As you all know, the Republic of Korea is our, strong, staunch ally. But again, I'd have to have you talk to DOD about that.
One more question
Yeah.
on North Korea still. So the North Korean state media released a statement recently saying that North Korea is ready for both dialogue and war. I believe that's a direct quote. What is the U.S. response to that?
They said they're ready for both dialogue and war.
Yes.
I guess countries have to be ready for every eventuality, don't they?
So your response is we are too?
That doesn't sound too dissimilar from the United States policy. Our preferred approach is diplomacy. That is something that the Secretary in his interview over the weekend and many times has talked about the importance of diplomacy, and there's so many countries that have signed on and are backing our diplomatic approach as well. However, if that should fail, and we certainly hope it would not, the United States government is prepared to respond in that type of way. Things like that always have to be backed up by a credible military response if at all necessary. But what we do here in this building is diplomacy.